Hi, this is a draft version of my talk, How Critical Thinking Education Fails to Prepare Students to Deal with Propaganda Campaigns. Since this is the 21st century, I can actually circulate a draft of this talk as a video, so I thought I'd give that a shot. Content warning, at one point I'm going to show an image from a style guide to a Nazi propaganda website. The image contains a slur which I have blacked out. Right now, the United States is seeing the spread of all kinds of beliefs that are not just harmful, but obviously irrational to anyone who doesn't hold them. These beliefs include small-scale destructive movements like the Qanon and Pizzagate conspiracy theories, also global threats like vaccine and climate change denialism. On one level, these beliefs are the product of a failure of critical thinking. If people were thinking critically, they wouldn't believe these things. But on a deeper level, these are not just failures of critical thinking, because the cause of the failure lies elsewhere. Contrary to appearances, people are not getting more foolish. People have been caught in a wave of what can best be described as social epistemic collapse. The normal social mechanisms that help people form beliefs have been disrupted. That's why we are seeing people believing that COVID vaccines contain microchips that track your location, or that COVID can be cured with horse dewormer, or that the Democratic Party is running a child sex trafficking ring out of a random DC pizza joint. In some ways, my talk today could be said to be an extended response to this meme. It's a computer screen that says, whenever a child learns critical thinking, somewhere conspiracy theory dies. And my basic response is, not the way we currently teach it. Critical thinking education leaves students unable to cope with propaganda because critical thinking education is focused largely on individual practices of good belief formation. However, propaganda works by many mechanisms besides the direct creation of false beliefs in individuals. The primary focus of the critical thinking movement since the writing of Dewey and Glasser has been on arguments, understood as reasons expressed in propositional form to accept other propositions. The idea of critical thinking has expanded in many ways since this origin. However, the focus has remained largely on individual processes of good belief formation. The problem is propaganda serves functions besides getting individuals to believe things that aren't true. It aims to affect things other than belief, and it aims to act at levels other than the individual level. One of the final results of a propaganda campaign is a group of people who believe things that obviously aren't true. But this isn't a direct outcome, and it isn't the most important outcome. So in the first section of this talk, I'm going to discuss theories of propaganda and argue that propaganda does not primarily function by directly creating false beliefs in individuals. In the second section, I'm going to talk about how the techniques we teach in critical thinking education play into the hands of propagandists. In the final section, I will argue that to teach students to fight propaganda, we must use ideas developed by political organizers and people who are actually fighting propaganda campaigns. There are two dominant traditions in theorizing propaganda. One is best labeled the belief first or ideology tradition, because it takes for granted the idea that the role of propaganda is to change individual belief. This is the tradition that begins with Marx and is now best represented by Jason Stanley. I follow the contrasting tradition, which argues that the aim of propaganda is not to change belief, although the members of this tradition differ about what the actual aim is. Following Hiska, I'm going to call this the holist tradition, to emphasize the range of functions propaganda can serve besides changing belief. Also following Hiska, I'm going to put particular emphasis on one non-epistemic function of propaganda, the ability to create or disrupt group agency. So the holist tradition goes back to the mid-20th century and the work of Arendt, Sartre, and Ellul. Current philosophers in this tradition include Hiska, Wimberly, and Taiwo. All of these thinkers take Stanley as their foil. A simple way to understand the holist approach to propaganda is through the revelation that Sartre had in Anti-Semite and Jew about the bizarre claims made by Nazi propaganda during the occupation of France. Sartre essentially realized that the Nazis were just trolling. Their goal was not to convince people, but to bully them. Never believe that the anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with the discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. Sartre's description here is bound to resonate with anyone who's seen contemporary Nazis operate online. This cruel, laughing tone was explicitly promoted in the style guide for the contemporary Nazi website, The Daily Stormer, which said, "The tone of the site should be light. The unindoctrinated should not be able to tell if we are joking or not." And you can see the blacked out slur there. So, in addition to bullying and trolling, preposterous claims can be used as a show of power. In so-called hard propaganda, a government marshals the enormous state media apparatus to trumpet something everyone knows is false, because it causes the population to despair of any possibility of organizing resistance to the regime. Hiska illustrates this using contemporary studies of contemporary China and Syria. Olufemi Taiwo lists a wide variety of things that propaganda can do without introducing false beliefs, including controlling what kind of issues can be broached publicly, shaping public perceptions of salience, controlling who is considered an authoritative speaker on a topic, and creating incentives and disincentives for different forms of speech. Wimberly argues that propaganda genuinely transforms the identity of the people subjected to it, transforming their desires and interests so they become a consumer base, or members of an ethnic group, or members of an economic class. Most importantly, propaganda can either nurture or suppress group agency. This is the core insight that Hiska has, drawing on the work of Arendt. What's remarkable here is that propaganda is not only not acting to create false beliefs, it's not acting at the individual level at all. Hiska's example of hard propaganda can show how propaganda can suppress a sense of group agency. She also discusses the so-called propaganda of the deed practiced by 19th century anarchists, which attempted to use political violence to show the working class that they do have agency here. The key insight is that there is a direct connection between the actions of the propagandists and the creation or dissolution of group agency without the intermediary step of belief formation. So this is where Arendt's ideas about totalitarian propaganda become so important. According to Arendt, the success of totalitarian movements creates the social reality that in turn sustains the absurd beliefs held by members of those movements. The assumption of a Jewish world conspiracy was transformed by totalitarian propaganda from an objective, arguable matter into the chief elements of Nazi reality. The point was the Nazis acted as though the world were dominated by Jews and needed a counter-conspiracy to defend itself. Racism for them was no longer a debatable theory of dubious value, but it was realized every day in the functioning hierarchy of a political organization whose framework would have made it very unrealistic to question it. The propaganda causes the social movement, and then the social movement causes the belief. So the causal order runs propaganda, social movement, belief. Arendt's evidence for this is that the belief collapses right after the social order does. Without the force of the movement, its members cease at once to believe in the dogma for which yesterday they were ready to sacrifice their lives. The moment the movement, that is, the fictitious world which sheltered them, is destroyed, the masses revert to their old status of isolated individuals who either happily accept a new function in a changed world or slink back to their old desperate superfluousness. I believe this is exactly what we are seeing with the still ongoing campaign by Trump supporters to overturn the results of the 2020 election, the so-called Stop the Steal movement. In the last election, 291 Republican candidates for House, Senate, or statewide office denied the legitimacy of the 2020 election. And of those, 178 have won office. This is despite the fact that 61 out of the 62 legal cases filed by Trump alleging fraud have failed. And the one that succeeded only succeeded in showing that a handful of voters were denied the right to cure ballots that had been cast without proper ID. The Stop the Steal movement is driven by propaganda, which flows through old media like Fox and talk radio, and new media like Truth Social and 4chan, and most importantly, through existing social networks, like the networks of personal relationships of members of the military and law enforcement that formed the basis of the Oath Keeper militia. One result of this is that about 2,000 rioters stormed the United States Capitol as the part of a coup attempt. Like the Nazi soldiers Arendt described, many of these people believed in the cause enough to lay down their lives, and 4 of them actually died. Now many, arrested and isolated from the social movement that gave their actions meaning, are saying that they were just caught up in the moment. Others, housed together in Block CB2 of the DC jail and facing inhumane jailing conditions, continue to form a community that supports each other and belief in the cause. So, my hypothesis about the Stop the Steal movement is that the causal order runs Stop the Steal propaganda creates Stop the Steal as a social movement, which creates belief that the election was stolen. So we have seen that propaganda relies on many mechanisms besides creating false beliefs in individuals. This means that critical thinking courses can actually leave us more open to the harmful effects of propaganda because critical thinking courses focus so much on individual processes of good belief formation. A large national education infrastructure, over a century in the making, has been built to promote and guide the teaching of critical thinking. This infrastructure began with John Dewey's ideas on good belief formation in his 1910 book, How We Think. Things really took off, though, when Edward Glasser identified a standardized test to measure how well students formed beliefs on Dewey's model and demonstrated that education can have an effect on these test results. After that, the idea of critical thinking could be wedded to the standardized testing juggernaut, which had been going strong since World War I. These days, every stakeholder in higher education, teachers, administrators, employers, all agree that students should graduate with good critical thinking skills. And official outcome lists for courses, programs, and whole institutions are written accordingly. Consulting firms compete to screen your students or employees with standardized tests, often derived with little modification from Glasser's 1941 original, despite the fact that people have been calling attention to its flaws throughout the history of the test. From the beginning, the key selling point for the critical thinking movement was that critical thinking could help students see through manipulative advertising and propaganda, and in general, prepare students to be good citizens in a democratic society. In fact, the first publication of the first critical thinking test was paid for by the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, IPA, which had been founded in 1937 by a group of centrist intellectuals and journalists to combat the spread of disinformation from both extreme right-wing and left-wing groups. One of the IPA's major publications was an analysis of the propaganda of anti-Semitic radio preacher Father Coughlin, who was like the Alex Jones of his day, except he was receiving funding indirectly from Nazi Germany. Coughlin's newsletter at the time was serializing the anti-Semitic hoax document, Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the IPA was essentially trying to combat this with a critical thinking test and a short book of informal fallacies. The importance of critical thinking for democracy continued to be a selling point for the movement through the end of the 20th century. It is emphasized in the Delphi Report, for instance, commissioned by the American Philosophical Association and many of the writings of prominent current proponents of critical thinking. Critical thinking, from its inception to the present day, has been focused fairly exclusively on individual practices of good belief formation. For Dewey, good thinking was just considering beliefs in terms of their evidence. Glasser took this idea over wholesale. As late as the 1960s, Robert Ennis was saying that critical thinking was at root the correct assessment of statements. The notion of critical thinking expanded in the second half of the 20th century, but the focus remained on individual belief and evidence. For instance, people began to include hypothesis formation as a part of critical thinking. And they emphasized that the critical thinker should not just have the skills to think critically, but actually be disposed to think critically in real situations. The output of critical thinking was expanded to include action as well as belief, although actions were all assimilated to belief in the form of should statements, so it didn't really get that much beyond Dewey's original idea. People also began to take social factors into account. However, this was always thought of in terms of rational discourse. The dialogue could be adversarial, but it was always done in the background of good faith, at least to the extent that the interlocutors would have to admit that they have been refuted when they were refuted. The pragmatics of deliberately violating canons of rationality were not considered. So, on the traditional model of critical thinking, propaganda becomes simply a series of bad arguments, often laughably bad. For instance, on May 5, 1921, a lawyer named John Brakey, who was working to overturn the results of the Arizona vote of the 2020 election, asserted that 40,000 ballots were actually smuggled from Arizona to Arizona from China. To prove this, his group, Audit USA, was scanning ballots with a UV light to see if there was bamboo in the paper. So here he is talking to an Arizona journalist. I would play the clip if we were live, but I think it would cause a copyright takedown if I put it on YouTube. So, from a critical thinking standpoint, this hypothesis and the purported evidence for it is absurd. A critical thinker has been trained to ask questions, and innumerable questions rush to the fore when confronted with Brakey's argument. Why would bamboo fibers be evidence that the ballots came from China, other than a racist association between China and bamboo? Can you even detect bamboo with UV light? What is so special about these ballots that they have to be smuggled from China at all? Are domestic forgeries inferior? A critical thinker asks these questions because their answers would completely undermine Brakey's arguments. And the critical thinker believes that that is sufficient to thwart Brakey's plans. But really, even voicing these questions plays into Brakey's hands. Brakey's claims are bullshit in the Frankfurtian sense that the speaker is indifferent to whether they are true or false. But more importantly, they are propaganda. To call something bullshit is to dismiss it as unworthy of consideration because the speaker does not even intend it to be true. Call something propaganda is to say that it is very much worthy of consideration because of all the things the speaker is trying to do besides assert truth. And it is only by considering all these things that Brakey is trying to do, besides assert the truth, that we can see why a traditional critical thinking perspective plays into his hands. So what is Brakey doing? For one, Brakey's assertion bullies election workers by forcing a massive recount effort on the basis of no real evidence. He is demonstrating his own power and demoralizing hardworking, civic-minded volunteers. He is also expanding the range of what can be said in public, thus opening the door for people to make similar claims in other states. Furthermore, Brakey is taking up public attention, allowing him to keep the idea alive, even though it has no merits. The most important thing Brakey is doing, though, is trying to create a social reality in which the truth of his absurd assertions must go unquestioned. And this is Arendt's fundamental point. Propaganda creates the social movement. Across the country, election officials have been put into place who deny the outcome of the 2020 election. If this movement were to achieve its ultimate aim, it would create a totalitarian social structure of the sort Arendt described. in which the claim that the 2020 election was rigged would be a matter of unquestioned belief, because the causal order here is propaganda social movement belief. Every single one of these propaganda goals is actually furthered by attempting to respond to the propaganda at the level of argument. Calling attention to the absurdity of the argument plays into the propagandist's strategy of showing strength by forcing people to comply with an absurd argument, and further demoralizes the poll workers who have to submit to it. Simply engaging with the argument grants legitimacy to it and does the propagandist's work for them. This squanders more public attention. Most of all, it actually feeds into the formation of the social movement. The kind of social movement being formed here contains what T. Nguyen calls disagreement reinforcement mechanisms, which causes resistance to a set of beliefs to be taken to be evidence for those beliefs. Arguing reinforces the echo chamber. So essentially, critical thinking classes just set up students to make the mistake of actually debating a troll who keeps yelling, "Why don't you debate me?" If a focus on individual belief formation does little to help students cope with propaganda, what would help? Well, in the longer version of this project, I have a discussion of teaching cognitive bias and the ways that that can help and the ways it can't. The part of the solution I want to focus on now is teaching terminology that was developed by people actively engaged in the work of fighting toxic propaganda, especially names for common tactics of bad faith actors. An obvious example of a term that needs to be included in the modern repertoire of critical thinking concepts is the word that describes the situation that I just mentioned, where someone is followed by a troll who keeps yelling, "Why won't you debate me?" The term is called sea lioning. It was originally coined by David Malky in his comic Wondermark and refers to a form of online harassment where the harasser makes a pretense of wanting to have a rational debate when really their only goal is abuse. In the cartoon, one character mentions to another that they don't like sea lions. Out of nowhere, a sea lion appears and asks with exaggerated civility to see any evidence that sea lions are harmful. The sea lion proceeds to follow the characters into their home and even into their bedroom, insisting that they owe it an explanation for their attitudes. This is just one example. A good critical thinking course should talk about things like gaslighting and concern trolling and bullshit and Brandolini's bullshit asymmetry principle. We need to talk about the politics of platforming and deplatforming. We need to use terminology from people who work on intimate partner violence, including DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. We need to talk about stochastic terrorism and the fig leaves that are used to disguise calls for violence. We need to talk about agnogenesis, the deliberate creation of ignorance, as illustrated by the greatest agnogenesis campaign of all time, the decades-long campaign to neutralize the knowledge that cigarettes cause cancer. So one interesting thing about using terminology developed by people in the front lines is that the same tactics keep getting rediscovered. One tactic that has been crucial for the Trump movement has been given lots of names in lots of different battles. The Rand Corporation, analyzing the propaganda tactics of the Putin regime, dubbed it the fire hose of falsehood. In discussions of evolution denial, it is known as the Gish Gallop. But the best description of the strategy, to my mind, comes from one of its best practitioners. Steve Bannon explained to the journalist Michael Lewis the way to neutralize journalists. Flood the zone with shit. I think those of us who are in the zone and are now flooded with shit have a visceral sense of the effects of this tactic. It not only stymies attempts at social organization, it induces despair at the thought that one could ever actually figure out what is actually going on to manage to do something to change it. I think at least one of the names of flooding the zone with shit should be on the vocab lists for critical thinking students. And if the chief campaign strategist of the President of the United States can use that kind of language, then maybe the students we are preparing to deal with with those campaign tactics can use that kind of language too. So another interesting thing about propaganda tactics, especially tactics like flooding the zone with shit, is that their effects are really only visible when they are reproduced on a massive scale. Many propaganda techniques only work when scaled up. This means that simply discussing how the individual student might interact with an individual piece of propaganda will miss the primary mode of action of propaganda. You can only see the effects of flooding the zone with shit if you are looking at the entire zone. Agnogenesis, too, is a tactic that really only becomes visible at the social level. When an anonymous executive at Brown and Williamson declared, "Doubt is our product," they did so knowing that a little individual skepticism is reasonable and good. It is only at the mass level that reasonable skepticism turns into regulatory paralysis. This means we need to use real-world examples of mass propaganda campaigns, although we must bear in mind that attempts to debunk disinformation also amplify disinformation. Fortunately, as we've seen, actual propagandists tend to explain their plans, either in internal documents or directly to the public, like cartoon villains. One final suggestion on the theory of propaganda I am proposing. Propaganda is continuous with political organizing. As Arendt says, organization and propaganda, rather than terror and propaganda, are two sides of the same coin. This means This means when we teach about propaganda, we should teach theories of political organizing. So I want to close with an idea from political organizing that I think people should be aware of: mutual interest organizing. This idea has its roots in Derek Bell's notion of interest convergence. Basically, Bell saw that civil rights advanced when black people and white people recognized that they had a mutual interest in it advancing. This is incredibly important because the history of white supremacy in America is basically the history of poor and working class people, white people, hurting themselves in order to inflict an even greater pain on black people. This pattern is only reversed when black people and white people see that they have a common interest in doing things like building a robust shared public infrastructure. So this is the principle of mutual interest organizing. Social movements happen when diverse people recognize they have a common interest. Robust social change cannot come from altruism alone. This is how group agency is actually created. So, to conclude, Harry Frankfurt begins the essay on bullshit by marveling at the amount of bullshit in our culture. But I think the study of propaganda makes it clear why there is so much of it. It serves so many uses. People in the media have flirted with calling this the post-truth era. That phrase never caught on. I think because it implies that somehow statements have stopped being either true or false. But people who are dismayed by the times we live in rightly want to cling to the truth. Better to say we live in an era ruled by bullshit. If we are to prepare our students to live in an era of bullshit, we must teach them the ways of bullshit. Fortunately, we live in precedented times. All the propaganda techniques I have been discussing were deployed throughout the last century, and those efforts were documented both by the people producing the propaganda and the people falling victim to it. We have the tools we need to win this fight.